This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube and wish to listen to this program as a podcast, you may click the link below to your favorite podcast platform. This talk is with Mark Thornton Burnett, Professor of Renaissance Studies at Queen's University, Belfast. Among his many contributions to scholarship on Shakespeare and early modern studies, Mark has been deeply involved over recent years with Shakespeare in world film and Shakespeare in global adaptation. This involvement includes an enormous amount of research, but there are two of Mark's books that we will focus on first: Shakespeare and World Cinema, and more recently, Hamlet and World Cinema. Mark is a trustee and director of the British Shakespeare Association and a fellow of the English Association, and also a member of the Royal Irish Academy. This series is funded with institutional support from Aoyama Gakuin University and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Mark, your work is so compendious and far-reaching that any attempt to summarize it quickly just wouldn't pass muster. In recent years, you've done an enormous amount of work on Shakespeare in film, specifically world or global cinema. This area overlaps with another interest of yours, and that being global Shakespearean adaptation. This focus on global media and adaptation was an extra gear that you found after your earlier and very significant contributions to scholarship on Shakespeare and early modern drama. So in the context of two of your more recent books, the first being Shakespeare and World Cinema, the second, and most recent being a direct focus on Hamlet and World Cinema, both of these, even without the exquisite critical analyses that you offer, gather vast amounts of valuable data and also bring up some big, indeed global questions about media and adaptation. Big questions or even arguments about what qualifies as Shakespearean. I would like to ask you to describe your own standard for what qualifies as Shakespeare and comment on how comfortably or uncomfortably you are positioned alongside other, let's say, more rigid views. For starters, though, at what point is it Shakespeare or not Shakespeare, Hamlet or not Hamlet?
Gosh, that's a very challenging question for first thing Monday morning, Tom, but a very important question too. Thank you so much for the questions. Thank you so much for this opportunity as well to talk to you.
It's our pleasure.
So I guess an older paradigm of adaptation studies would be to compare the original play with the adaptation, and often to the detriment of the adaptation, so that the original is canonized and pedestalized and seen as in some ways superior, and the adaptation in some ways inferior. Thankfully, that view is being superseded, and we now have a recognition of adaptation studies as a very important field, not just that, but also adaptations themselves as of value in their own right. So I guess that would be where I would align myself in terms of, what's Shakespeare and what's not Shakespeare. I value the not Shakespeare. I value the adaptations. I also think it's important in valuing the adaptations to keep in mind the Shakespearean text with which it has a relationship, but always in a kind of competitive and a struggle for primacy kind of a way.
Yeah, if we put the same standard, if we applied the same standard to Shakespeare, of course, the same thing could be said, because, he's gathering from materials. It's a stream. And I kind of like to envision it as this big river. And of course, Shakespeare is a wide point in the river, but it's a stream of cultural influence that goes well before Shakespeare, into Shakespeare, and on outward. And why even think of discouraging it, right?
Exactly. I mean, we need to get away from the idea that there's a point of origin. There are cycles of repetition, and cycles of creativity, and Hamlet is a perfect instance of that, because of course Shakespeare's Hamlet didn't spring out of the dramatist's imagination fully formed. It itself was part of a process, and we know that from all the excellent work being done by textual critics of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And in terms of Hamlet as an adaptation, I think that was the other part of your question. So is it Hamlet? Is a film adaptation of Hamlet? Hamlet? I'd say yes, it is, but just in a slightly different form. I think of a film like a Brazilian film, O Jogo da Vida e da Morte. It's a 1971 adaptation of Hamlet, or a South Indian film, Karma Yogi, 2012. These are adaptations that take the lineaments and the impetus of Hamlet, but they repurpose the play either by subtraction or in fact by addition, so that we end up, to refer to my previous answer, with an adaptation that is of value in its own right.
Yeah, I completely am with you here. Of course, I'm in Japan, and you really can't expect an entire other nation with a language of its own for centuries and centuries to encounter. Well, would we expect it of the Germans when they translated Shakespeare into German? Would we expect it? We do have this West-East divide, and there is that. But the fact of the matter is, why can't someone translate into their own language and use their own concept and fuse it, as it's been done many times in Japan and also in India? Otherwise, it can't survive. You can't transport a 16th century or a Victorian Shakespeare into a completely different culture.
Well, I mean, I'm so glad you've mentioned that, because the other huge aspect of all of this is, of course, translation. What happens when Shakespeare's plays are translated into languages that are not English? And I would say the same thing as per adaptation. Translation is a further facilitative and creative act that actually, as I have found in working on Hamlet, takes you back to Hamlet and makes you look at Hamlet differently.
Yes,
it's a tiny detail here, but I was working recently on an African adaptation of Hamlet in French with some African languages, and there's the translation of that particular representation of the ghost is described as most Lazar-like in Shakespeare's Hamlet. That had never kind of resonated with me. In the French, mediated in the African production, it becomes comme un lèpre, like a leper. So there's a whole association there of leprosy and disease and the ghost that came to life for me through the act of translation.
That you don't see even in your own native tongue. And of course, we have studied this, and we feel as if we maybe have gotten it all. And there isn't a year that passes by where I don't see something just like this, and I'm sure that happens with you all the time as you're gathering. I'm interested in the notion, if there are still people out there who feel that Shakespeare should be in English, and even film is getting away from the purity of the whole thing. Are there people out there who are active scholars working who reject the notion of any Shakespeare off of the stage, maybe even off of the page, and protest that, let's say, that a Shakespeare in another language, in Chinese or Japanese, or any of the many languages across the globe, do you think there are people out there who are still holding up to that?
No, I don't think so. I think that's an older construction. It's a tenacious one, but it's one that recent developments in adaptation studies are challenging. And I mean, I'd say, with reference to Japan, of course, the great example of Shakespeare being translated into cinema in Japan is Kurosawa, and Throne of Blood really uses very little of Shakespeare's language, and yet it's such a marvelous reinvention of the play, such a marvelous resituating of the play in samurai Japan, that inevitably Shakespeare's Macbeth takes on all sorts of fresh complexions.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Now let's get to your books. Let's start with Shakespeare, World Shakespeare, and then move to Hamlet. Yeah,
Sure. For a while, I was thinking about a historical approach. So you start at the advent of film and you move up to the present. That didn't seem quite to do it. Then I thought about an approach that would look at decades. That didn't seem quite to do it. So of the various approaches that I had on the table in front of me, I suppose what I did eventually, and that is reflected in the book you're describing, I prioritized three choices. I prioritized the choice of the auteur, the individual creative practitioner. I prioritized the choice of a regional or a nation-specific approach, and I prioritized the approach of looking at an individual play. Any one of those approaches would have done for a whole study. But I wanted, I suppose, three different entrance points into Shakespearean world cinema to try and give a flavor of the richness and the diversity and the complexity.
Yeah, and you chose two plays, Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet, and of course
I did.
Yeah,
and then I felt a bit bad about it because I'd neglected Hamlet. So
let's go to Hamlet.
Do something else.
Yeah, well, Hamlet now has a full book, and this is you start with Western Europe, and I think in the earlier book, and maybe in this book also, we talked about the problem of there being the West and the rest.
Yes.
Right? That there seems to be an overemphasis on the English-speaking cultures, North America, well, the UK and North America, of course, and but you start there, and then you move out to Africa and Brazil, China and Japan, and then you look into regional paradigms and also Turkish Hamlet and Iranian. I love that anecdote you had about getting a permission to enter Iran, right? But this thing has taken you on adventures.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And to which involves going to archives, doing a lot of detective work in trying to find titles, meeting with practitioners, and really enjoying and thrilling to and being excited by the whole project. It's a slightly parodic mode of organization.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And also coming across these things, Mark, I don't think there is the cultural apparatus out there that can preserve these works. And we're talking about film, and we think of, you know, I'm sure you've had this experience. I have, trying to remember a film that I loved 400 years ago, you know, when I was young, and trying to find it. And some films of the period are there, some very fine films, but then this particular film is missing. And in that time, it wasn't an insignificant film. It was right there with the others that had been preserved. So it's not, for some reason. And of course, that's something that I've been interested in throughout my career. So why something survives and why it doesn't. And it might be simply because Mark Burnett didn't come along and put it in a book that, you know, was published by Cambridge University Press, and then somebody else picks it up later on, you know, and we have it. Do you think that there is a way that these things, because it's film, can it be digitally preserved as a film? Are there repositories where these films can have a safe home for years afterwards? Are those, is that possible?
It is possible, and it's increasingly being done. And I think the reason why one film is extant and another film isn't, it's to do with the accidents and the contingencies of distribution. If a film garners international festival exposure, it has a longer shelf life. If it doesn't, if it circulates only within a narrower set of parameters, it's potentially more short-lived. There are films that I wanted to talk about in that book, but I couldn't because they were absolutely lost There's no way they could have been
there.
recovered. Some surviving only in stills, others just having been thrown out when a studio closed. The concomitant problem, of course, is that in an older form, a film was made on nitrate acetate stock, and that can decompose. So you get to a point where a film has decomposed so much it's irrecoverable.
Yeah.
But I did manage to come across some that I thought would be more difficult to locate. But then there are all sorts of archival questions that you come up against as well. Archives can open and close, and that depends upon state funding.
Yeah.
Other archives can have policies whereby they only start at the modern period and work backwards, as opposed to starting in the silent period and working forwards. And by the time that happens, a whole history has disappeared. One lovely example, I think it's lovely, is of an African Hamlet adaptation, Hamili, from 1964, that was thought lost. It was then found in the Library of Congress, actually, in Washington, in a televised recording, and that recording has been digitized and is available back in Ghana now, where the film was originally made.
Yeah, I spoke with Alexa Jobin a little over a year ago, and the MIT Global Shakespeare's project, they seem to have something set up there ready to preserve. Yes. And what a great thing. Right?
Exactly, that's another fantastic digital resource that is doing great work in all of these areas.
The problem, and if I were at Hyde Park Corner now, there were a box out there, I'd probably stand on it and scream this out to the world. But there is, I don't know whether it's more so in Japan or whether I just live here and I see it, and you would see it if you lived anywhere else. But the reluctance in some cases to put a production in a situation where it's out of the mainstream. You're not going to make a lot of money on it. Just make it available, right? And in doing so, there might be some kind of income flow that is created for whatever. But the reluctance to do that with, let's say, just regular staged plays, right, where you make a simple recording. I think back to when I studied at the Shakespeare Institute before it became the Shakespeare Institute. I'm aging myself, but would I love to see Patrick Stewart again playing Barbas? He was just wonderful. He had his wonderful Barbas. And other examples, Glenda Jackson and Peter Brooks, Antony and Cleopatra. Were that preserved, right? It's just splendid stuff. But we didn't think of it. Well, the BBC at that time was thinking in that way, and they did a few things. There's that Ian McKellen Edward II, which is just stunning. Well, and they didn't do that much, did they? You've seen that one, I'm sure.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard the recording.
Yeah, well, it's just simple camera work, a few close-ups here and there. And it's just outstanding and very, very usable in a teaching situation.
Sure.
Well, we've been talking about you as a writer of books from the Cambridge University Press, but you're also doing two things at once. I don't know how you find the time to do this, but you're the general editor of a series on adaptation, and you're also working on a specific edition, and at the same time including articles in that edition, specifically Indian Shakespeare's. And I'm interested in what's going on with the Indian influence there.
So the series you mentioned, Tom, that's Shakespeare Adaptation. We started that this year with Bloomsbury Academic, and it's a series of studies, both book-length studies and edited collections on the theme of Shakespeare adaptation. It seems to be a very important topic to prioritize at the moment. I guess there are two distinctive things that we're doing with it. One is that it has a global reach, and the other is that we're looking back in history. So it's not just adaptation as a contemporary phenomenon. It's adaptation as a historical phenomenon. We do have an edited collection in that series that I'm involved in called Women in Indian Shakespeares, and that came out of an accident of two funding applications, one to the Leverhulme and one to Marie Curie, simultaneously being successful. So I don't quite know how that happened, but I was lucky enough and in the privileged position to be working with two postdoctoral scholars, Dr. Tara Buckley and Dr. Rosa Periaggio, and we formed a grouping at Queen's, and all had this common interest in Shakespeare and Indian cinemas. Seemed the logical thing to collaborate on a volume that reflected those interests.
Yeah. Well, I'm very interested in seeing what you have come up with. Well, that's just out. Is that right? That's just out.
Not quite. Not quite. I don't think so. It's so the idea for that book, Women in Indian Shakespeares, I guess it was a two-pronged approach. One was that we wanted to explore ideas of women in representation, but we also wanted to look at women as creatives. So the book is balanced between it navigates a course between the critical and the creative. We have a roundtable with creative practitioners, directors, translators, but we also have essays on the representation of women and women characters in a variety of media, including translation, film, and popular press.
Right. So the title there is Women in Indian Shakespeare, soon to be out. And yes, you have all kinds of other things, it seems, in the hopper there with that series. And
yes,
may I ask you what we can expect to see coming forward here with the...
You may, yes. So there's that title. Just published is a book by Bill Carroll on Macbeth, adapting Macbeth, really terrific book. Very happy to have that launching the series.
Yes.
We have another collection coming out on Romeo and Juliet later in the year. And then we have a collection, Lockdown Shakespeare, on the phenomenon of Shakespearean performance during the pandemic. And that's almost out. So there are 4 titles out this year. We'll be having an online book launch later in the year, and there are other titles under contract and in preparation. So I'm hopeful that there'll be some longevity.
Oh, I think there certainly will. Now, this is just it's kind of overwhelming me a little bit here, because I'm thinking like I do some digital humanities scholarship, and I'm thinking like that at this time. It seems to me that there should be a way to enter this into a kind of a data set and I think that I read somewhere where somebody might be doing something like that, but there's so much here, Mark, that can be reshaped in so many different ways.
Well, yes, there is, but there's still a lot more to do. I mean, it's very interesting you talk about data collection. Alexa's MIT resource, Global Shakespeare, is absolutely fantastic. I mean, there are others out there as well. There's one called Asia, and there are hard copy books. There's a collection called Shakespeare's After Shakespeare, edited by Richard Burke. All of these are magnificent efforts to capture the diversity and variety of the field. There's still more examples that we don't know about and that we need to capture. Somewhere there's some massive collaborative enterprise that would involve scholars from all around the world in an ongoing basis. And Alexa has the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Global Shakespeare. That's also wonderful. It's a fantastic opportunity that we're still finding things to say and things to find out.
Yeah. Oh, just more and more every day. And I feel more, and I think that you and I probably do share this, that we were schooled in a certain way. Now, I had several just absolutely superb teachers. It's
Mm.
inspirational, obviously.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, taking a guy like me from the American South who's supposed to go into some kind of sales job, I don't know, you know, and finding a way to make that guy love Shakespeare. There had to be great
yeah,
teachers, but there
yes,
was a way of seeing it, right? That we at that time, we felt more liberalized at the time, but basically we were, you know, shared a sort of colonial perspective, an iconic Shakespeare, the great genius, which there is genius there. But over time, as we've seen this unravel, then that has opened up so much more
yes,
in critical interpretation, hasn't it? And
yes, yes, it certainly has. I mean, I was in the fortunate position to be taught by a scholar of literature and a scholar of history, Emrys Jones and Keith Thomas. So
yeah,
I always had a kind of literary historical bias in my training. And I wasn't particularly interested in adaptation or film in the work I did earlier, but I probably still do try to use those historicist methods, which were
yeah,
inflected by new historicism in the 90s, in the 1980s and the 1990s, when I think about adaptation.
yeah. Well, I remember very well the work that you did on masters and servants in the 90s. We say in the 90s, but that's still out there. That whole idea of dominant, subdominant that you pulled out as a historicist critic. And it wasn't quite, you know, there were, even in the 90s, there were those people who sort of um, divided the field into a critical formalist who would stay within the text somehow, and historicist. And if you were doing history, you were called a new historicist, and that was a pejorative in certain circles.
Yes, yes.
So you went through that, and you talked about monsters. I remember that. Of course, your edition on Marlowe
Yeah.
really caught my attention.
You're Marlowe yourself.
I'm kind of a Marlowe guy, yeah. And it needed to be done. I remember thinking when it came, I said, thank goodness we had Fredson Bowers, but then is it just going to be Fredson Bowers forever, right? And you went and did that. So you've had this extraordinary career as an editor, and you just keep going and going. But there is a turn here, and it's really in the first decade of this century that it's a fairly big turn. And I wonder what it was that made you start thinking this way, moving out into the globe, so to speak.
That's a very good question. Well, my first full-time job was in Northern Ireland, Queen's University of Belfast, where I still teach.
Yeah.
I'm not from Northern Ireland by upbringing. Yeah. I'm English, so there was a bit of a kind of culture shift for me coming here.
Yeah.
And I suppose two things happened really. Teaching Shakespeare in an environment that has historically been sort of discontinuous and contested, and where there are different constructions of Shakespeare depending upon who you talk to, I became quite self-conscious about the literary canon. Mm-hmm. You know, self-conscious about my own identity and my own positionality, and I guess that got me thinking more broadly and sort of expansively. And probably the seeds for thinking about global Shakespeare were in my move here. At the same time, I was lucky enough to see all of Kenneth Branagh's films screened here for their premieres, including his Hamlet, which I saw at the Waterfront Hall here in Belfast in 70mm. First time I'd seen a film in that widescreen format, and I was just blown away by it. Yeah. And I had to write about it. Hamlet's always been a favorite of mine from school, but right. Seeing this film version in all of this opulence really fired me and ignited me. Yeah. And that's probably where the shift to film came in.
Yeah. He did do that, didn't he? He started with Henry V, and I was just astounded because I felt like I was part of the, well, the cool alternative crowd. Henry V, what Yeats said, it was sustained irony. And then this young guy comes out and says, "No, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to be an English hero." I had a friend who was getting his PhD at a prestigious university in America, and he said that he had become attracted to this French woman, and he decided to take her on a date, and he stupidly took her to a kind of premiere in the town of Henry V. And it didn't work out at all for him. But I thought it was just, the way he approached that. And then he did Hamlet, and he did Hamlet. I still use that because it's complete. It's complete.
Yes.
Unlike Olivier or Zeffirelli, and they both have those have their moments, but it's complete, as complete as we can get.
Yes.
And there's riveting scenes in that still I see it every year and see something new.
It's got, I mean, whatever one might think about how he's made that text complete, it's got all of the sub narratives and interstices in, and the Fortinbras plot is of itself its own story. Fortinbras keeps on coming in with his approach to Elsinore, and then it's fully foregrounded at the close, the takeover.
Well, it's inspired me to write on it. And if you have any trouble sleeping at some point, just let me know and I'll send you my Fortinbras. It's so boring. I mean, you have to know so much about the play to even begin to
look forward to looking.
But I felt like, that was part of how it was structured, because we were taught when we were young. I don't know if we were taught this, but we felt, okay, the guy who couldn't make up his mind is an existential drama. It is about Hamlet, and Branagh comes in and he says, no, it's about history too. It's about the changes in a political structure. And the historical element here is very strongly felt, and you can't get the play without getting that. And of course, it's Elizabethan, late Elizabethan England. You have all of this anxiety and about the change of with the monarchy. Who is it going to be? That kind of thing. And here you have it, like Shakespeare seems to always do, playing it off on another country, another time.
Yes.
Right.
I absolutely agree, and I think that's the real coup, really, of that interpretation, that he captures that fin de siècle anxiety. He rehistoricizes Hamlet from an Elizabethan period to another period, and I think it's also something going on with adaptations of Hamlet globally. If one looks at where the creative moments are in film history, and where the particular parts of the world are, I think Hamlet attracts to itself a cachet as a narrative about regime change that then lends itself to situations where these questions are in the air. Yeah,
and just how fragile all of that is, how fragile everything is. Just a stunning performance. Now you're in Belfast. And of course, that's Kenneth Branagh's, of course, the recent movie about his childhood and so forth. And you are involved with the Kenneth Branagh archive.
Yes.
And I'm very interested in that. What's going on there?
Well, many years ago, I guess I became, partly because I've always been interested in archives and exploring manuscript repositories. In the first part of my work, and then kind of film archives in the latter part of my work. I've always been very interested in that, and I was becoming concerned about how many repositories from the UK were going elsewhere, not staying in the UK. So I wrote to Branagh's people and tested out the possibility of a donation. Got a very gracious, welcoming reply. So it started simply with a letter asking about what was happening to the materials. We now have a substantial body of work reflecting Branagh's career, right from his early Billy plays to more recently. It encompasses theatre and film. there's correspondence, and there are a lot of reviews of the plays and the films, meaning that you can plot a trajectory of reception of Branagh's work nationally and internationally. And we use it in PhD. We use the archive is used in PhD projects. It's used in educational projects. It's used in public-facing exhibitions and conferences. There's a conference taking place next week on Branagh here in Belfast. So it's nice that it's being used in this way, and it's also important that it's used in this way.
Yeah, well, you asked me by email about teaching, using film for teaching. And of course we do, and titles of classes and so forth. And I sort of am apologetically have to admit that in the institutional structure where I work, the titles for classes would be, like for mine in Japanese, it would be lecture on British history, which is inaccurate. And then I make a syllabus. And of course, by the time anybody gets into the class, they know it's going to all be Shakespeare. So we're going to have trouble finding titles from the websites, but from individual teachers, if I can get out to enough teachers, I can see how they might, I can find out from them how they might structure. I don't think this is something that's a little different from Japan to maybe the UK, where you have students who have studied Shakespeare in high school, right? And by the time they get to college, if they're still going to do Shakespeare, they're interested in doing something new. So let's do film adaptation. Let's talk about how in a slow point, let's say in Hamlet, I've noticed this for years and years, is there's slow points in Hamlet. You just kind of operatic. You have to build it up. And Branagh's so good at just circling that camera around the actors, during the slow points, the introduction of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and just having it moving from one room to
just in terms of practicality, you have to give the performer who's doing Hamlet a break, don't you, from time to time?
Of course. And so I try to point that out in my class, but I'm not an expert on those kinds of things, making. But you do notice that after seeing it time and again, certain things that are just part of the genius of direction, the genius of acting. And I always try to explain to my students, because we have to spend so much time on the language itself. I do teach it in English in Shakespeare's language. I think it's very important. And it's just like when I was not the best student in the world reading Latin, that we went slowly. We didn't read like Romans, and same with any kind of language you try to learn. And so we'll go slowly, but we do that. But I still do want them to understand the it's not, I don't want to say collision, but it is kind of a creative collision between a creative artist living now coming across this material. And that same kind of impact was there in Shakespeare when you start looking at sources, as you, of course, have done very much. I want them to understand that. And in a way, it's because it can happen because of what wasn't written down. I mean, wouldn't we love to have stage directions for Hamlet, but that would have killed it, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I think that's another value aspect of adaptation, that one can come across a number of adaptations that create a backstory for a character in a way that a play doesn't do. This is where adaptation can amplify. And those things can be very revealing and illuminating. And similarly, there are adaptations which provide prologues, which extend from the end of the Shakespearean play and give us another narrative, making up in a way for a sense of loss.
Yeah, or positioning it. I just finished an article. I think I'm finished. I hope I'm finished, if the editor so allows, with a couple of my Japanese colleagues on the localized theater productions, was a focus not on the big theater, but these smaller groups. And I'll send, if you want any of this information, we will be happy to share it. And also how Shakespeare appears in anime and manga turned into anime, and anime turned into a series, how it goes from print to a visual medium, and then how this works through this new media universe that we're in now.
Yes.
And a lot of it.
And that's the great the pleasure of doing this kind of work, that you then have to think about, well, what are the most apposite theoretical paradigms to use to talk about those transferences. And in a Japanese context, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that Japanese anime versions of Shakespeare can go from print to screen animation to feature film, and then backwards again. So there's a whole kind of circularity of representation that needs attending to. And again, the question then becomes, well, what are the best methods for understanding this?
Yeah. You of course focused on women in Indian drama. There's a turnabout in Japanese anime and also the novels, that the books are still read by kids here. They still read these popular novels, kind of like my children read Harry Potter or the vampire stuff, the Twilight stuff. My daughter was into that for a while, and these things come along, but thankfully, for it seems every generation for kids to begin reading, but they do here too. And but the audience is largely young women, whereas I think if we looked into Shakespeare, most of the audience would have been young men. The Tybalt character is appealing to not Tybalt, but Mercutio's criticism of Tybalt is appealing to young men who have seen this pretentiousness and bravado out on the streets themselves, that sort of thing. But how they transfer that into a largely a young adult women's audience is just fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
It is, and also the position of woman as auteur, and in examples like Candy, the series which uses some Shakespearean interludes, or Osaka Hamlet. These are women anime artists.
Yes, the writers, the artists, and the writers. Are largely, and a lot of the production is done, I think, by women, and it's just astounding what they come up with. The affairs, setting up Henry VI. If you don't teach Henry VI, it gets rusty very quickly. But I had to go back and look at it. But one artist was saying, okay, we have Richard and we have Henry VI. Let's make them sort of maybe possibly lovers, and then make Richard androgyne instead of a humpback or whatever. He's just somewhere in between any kind of binary sexual position. They're just doing this. And also Romeos and Juliets, you have these extremely randy Juliet sometimes, or Juliet falls in love with her cousin Tybalt instead of Romeo, that kind of thing. They just play with it. And come up with some really astounding stuff. Because the source material there, Mark, is so good. And Shakespeare saw the source material and did what he did, and then you see that source.
And that gets us thinking about all the other huge debate in adaptation studies, which is about Shakespearean universality and Shakespearean locality. And of course, the paradigm for a long time was these are universal stories that mean the same things, but now with emphases on local and localized criticism, the template is much more sophisticated and finessed. And we're recognizing how these narratives, which are canonical, can be sort of decanonized and written against and upturned and inverted to suit very particularized moments of need, anxiety, preoccupation.
Yeah. Well, I wish we could. I can only implore our audience to just read what you've put out there, because if we started at one, I wanted to focus a little bit on Japan. In one of your books, there was a mention of the film noir, and it mentions a place, Nishiyogikubo. And I lived there for 8 years in Nishiyogikubo, and it was this feeling, I had no idea. Here, I should have known this when I was living there, and I do think it was a good place for that. I kind of have the Japanese word is natsukashi, a kind of homesickness for the period of time I lived there. It was a happy period, and now is a happy period too, but that was, and also Shibuya, which is right, I'm in Shibuya now as I'm speaking to you. So always, not always, but in more recent history, youth culture and the site of the Deguchi, the great director Deguchi, and the Jean Theater, where they did the whole canon in jeans and bare stage, back in the 70s or 60s, I think it started. So there's this whole history here that I'm now, after these years, I've started getting more and more interested in. I would say over the past 5 years, I think you provoked more interest. And I don't know, but because you're here, you don't sometimes see what's around you.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So if you came and visited, and I hope you can at some point, but if you came and visited, I'd say, okay, well, we need to show Mark something, and I'll go someplace that's just right down the road for me that I never go to myself. I will think sometime during the day, well, after Mark leaves, I'm going to come back here with my wife, and I love this. This was, and we never do. You have to have visitors, and I think Japanese feel very much the same way. They love visitors and that sort of thing. But that said, now in your work, when I read the acknowledgments of your work, there are so many people out there that you are in contact with. It's an enormous network, isn't it? It's an enormous network. And you are now part of the British, or have been part of the British Shakespeare Association, as a response to the fact that there wasn't one, right? And am I pronouncing that right? The British Shakespeare Association.
Yeah, the BSA.
Yeah, you're in the media and area. And is there anything coming up there? I know that conferences have been kind of curtailed; they've had to go online, that kind of thing. But are you back to face-to-face at all? And
well, first of all, on the acknowledgements, I think inevitably with a subject like World Shakespeare's or Global Shakespeare's, these have to be collaborative. There's no one person who can do this all on their own. So I'm very indebted to scholars who work in this area, and very beholden to all the people who help me and answer inquiries. And that's not just about content, that's also about language and translation. So these things have to be of necessity plural and multivocal. The BSA, yes, I'm a trustee of the British Shakespeare Association, along with others, and we do our best to promulgate activities in and around Shakespeare in an academic and educational and public-facing setting. Our last conference was online. That was during the pandemic. But we have high hopes for our next series of conferences. And then your other question, Tom, was about what I do on the BSA. So I try and make visible all the work that's going on in media and performance in and around the country. We've had a few events. We've had some film screenings and online talks to keep Shakespeare very much in the public eye.
Yeah, well, I was sort of throwing those together kind of unfairly. I was basically to come to the point that, and maybe this is a sense of discovery that I've had just doing this series, because I was going to invite people here, and now, we couldn't do it, and I had this money that I had to spend, and now we're finding this, and I'm going, I can talk to so many more people, right? And it's this discovery where I'm thinking, all you need to do is to go participate. That because it's the British Association doesn't mean that it's a standoffish, so I think some of my Japanese colleagues might be a little bit, oh, these are British, maybe they feel that we are. I'm going, no, they'd love to have you in. They would love, and I wanted to segue that with the numbers of people that you have worked with and this large, far-reaching community outside of the UK and so forth, but just how gracious and how eager scholars in the UK, in Belfast, or whether they're at Oxford or Cambridge or wherever they are, I've found nothing but graciousness, openness, and like in your case, just this eagerness to communicate beyond the islands there, and. So I think I wanted to express that to people who are viewing, that just get involved, love to see you, that kind of thing.
Well, that's very much the message that we're putting out in the BSA. We are reaching out. We're very proud of, and wanting to keep up and increase our international membership. And as for your other point, Tom, I mean, I think as an academic, I mean, I'm very fortunate to be an academic. It's a privilege to be an academic. I probably would have been doing what I'm doing if I'd had another job, or trying to do what I'm doing if I'd had another job, because I do enjoy so much. And if I'm in a classroom talking about, the subjects that really interest me, I'm thinking of an MA option I did just last semester on Shakespeare in Asia. What more could one ask?
Yeah. I was heading towards your Shakespeare in Asia class, and I saw this just before. You've got a lot out there, and I'm going, oh, I missed that. And you're doing Shakespeare in Asia, and so that's where I am right now. So, explain a little bit how you've structured that particular class.
So it was a bit of a challenge for me, because it was, getting back to your earlier point, so digital, and I'm not the most technologically versatile person. But we used a lot of digital resources for that module, both ones which had been sort of purpose built for the module, but also other kinds of resources that the students could access. And the way in which I structured it, it's getting back to our conversation of earlier, really, about competitions between texts and adaptations.
Mm-hmm.
I structured it in terms of a week on a text and a week on a series of adaptations, and then a week on another text, and then a week on the adaptations. I think we only had 3 Shakespeare plays across the whole module.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure that the students were sensitized to how to read a literary text, but also sensitized to how to read an adaptation. And that meant an introduction to film terminology. I would say film terminology is as important as poetry and literary and formal technology.
Oh, yeah.
And it also entailed a sort of optional aspect where the students were encouraged to go off and find an adaptation independently and come back and do a presentation on it in the light of what they'd learned about literary theory, film theory, and adaptation theory. And that proved very productive. It taught me.
Yeah, isn't that something, how you set up a class and you walk in and go, I'm going to have to learn how to do this myself as I'm teaching it, right? And you do. It's one of the joys. Well, I think we've all felt that way, even though we were born in different countries, and of course my Japanese colleagues, there's one point there where you just know that when you're doing this kind of thing, you're at home, that there's nothing else that you want. And I don't know enough about your career. My career, I got lucky. I got lucky a couple of times, and if that luck hadn't happened, now you can say I was in a position to be lucky, but if it hadn't happened, it wouldn't have been a very happy thing. It's a risk to going into this business, and increasingly over time, where we have to constantly remind people that, listen, this humanities thing, this thing that we do, the public actually does want this. There's some vociferous voices out there who may not want it, but so keep us around. And to go back to your note to Branagh's people, right? I think I tell my students this all the time, and I tell other people, graduate students and so forth, that the biblical proverb of asking you receive, sometimes not true, but if you don't ask, you won't receive.
Well, if you don't try, you don't know.
Right? Just try.
If you don't try, you don't know.
Yeah.
It's always worth trying.
It really is. It really is. And I have been absolutely, like when I contacted you, you immediately came back and said, yeah, I'll do this. Now, I'd never met you before this talk. And I just thought that I think that we probably have crossed paths somewhere along the way.
I think we have.
and so forth. And you're Marlowe, right? I've known your name. I'm going, listen,
yours.
I'm not going to live to be 5,000 years old. I'm not one of these biblical characters. I better meet this guy if I want to, now, because, you get to a point where you're counting down rather than counting up. And that's just been so just extraordinary that we've had this technology to do it, and that somehow I mustered. I'm usually a pretty shy guy about this kind of thing, but people have been so warm and receptive. And I keep wanting to push that out there to people who are in the profession that, I think you and I was talking about the great teachers we had. There were some teachers who could be really tough nuts to crack there. They were hard, and they were a little not approachable. We rebelled against that in our younger days, to be much more open and so forth. But there's still out there is this sense, I think, that there might be an in group that wouldn't want to talk to you. And I really encourage my Japanese colleagues to do as much as they can, because there's so much happening over here.
Well, I mean, we have to recognize all the dreadful things that the pandemic entailed, and all the sort of horrible pressures and realities. On the digital side, the pandemic has proved arguably more leveling than might have been anticipated, particularly in terms of online conference attendance, where you can get greater numbers of participants, and things like this, where hopefully larger audiences will be involved.
Yeah, over time. And I'd like to think that over time that I'm going to do this for some time longer, as long as we can get some funding and so forth. But that it will be a bit of an archive too. That it will mark a point in your life, a point in the life of these people. I'm trying to distribute it also with younger mid-career scholars, and of course global scholars. There's kind of a bias, and my American friends might. I'm probably more focused on a German scholar who is working on Shakespeare, or a Japanese scholar who is working on Shakespeare, because of the global nature of the program. But eventually you get to a lot of people. And I could do a lot more of this if I could do a lot more of this. Well, okay, what I'm going to do then is I want to return, as we sort of close up a little bit here, I'd like to return a little bit to the whole notion of what is and isn't Shakespeare. For instance, The Godfather is not Shakespeare, right? The movie The Godfather is not Shakespeare. But if we start looking closely, we might find some Shakespearean elements, because everybody who was involved in producing the movie studied Shakespeare at some point. A Coppola would have maybe something in his head. I'm wondering where the line is, but I think that it's wide.
Yes, it is
very
wide. And I think that there's some caveats, and one is, I don't think any cultural statement has to advertise itself as a Shakespearean adaptation to be read as a Shakespearean adaptation. I don't think it necessarily gives the adaptation any more kudos or authority to bill itself in a particular way in relation to Shakespeare. Rather, I think the issue is the reading practice and the sphere of reception.
Yeah.
A number of studies going on in adaptation studies at the moment about how you read Shakespeare into something. Now, there are all sorts of cultural issues, pros and cons around that, but I think it's quite productive. And if you're able to spot an inference or an echo, and you are finding that in the fabric of the work that you're attending to, the field does indeed become wider and richer and more interesting for it.
Yeah. Well, I like this in this transferability. That's where I'm headed with this, is that it's not just, if we take it as a kind of, let's take it as a mathematical formula. If you take Shakespeare as X, there's an expansion you can do throughout a large number of major cultural forms, where if you do shed off these, what garments that are prohibitive, that make people think that it belongs to here and only here, but not there, then you open up many other doors of inspiration and creative inspiration and art for any number of cultures to come back from, well, let's say back from the east to the west or whatever. I think that whole it will help to break down a lot of these unnecessary divisions.
I agree, and it doesn't have to be Shakespeare. I mean, it can be all kinds of other sort of founding and foundational texts in the Indian adaptations that I'm interested in at the moment. I mean, the Indian epics are a constant reference point. The Ramayana, the Mahabharata, as well as Shakespeare, because these are all cross-fertilizing elements of the matrix of the culture. And what's fascinating is how they intersect as well as individuate themselves in works of adaptation.
Yeah, because in the intersection, that's where something new happens, and that's what we're doing. Well, I think that you have set up a platform that will keep you going as long as you want to go. You have no worry about running out of things, because let's just say world cinema, right? Well, that was a few years ago now. So there's, part two. There's things that have come out in the past years. And it's just never going to run out. You've selected the absolutely perfect area of scholarship. It is, it is the river that flows, and it's just wonderful. Well, I hope that we get to see you in person at some point. And by we, I'm not using the royal we. I'm speaking for my friends in the Shakespeare Association, Shakespeare Society of Japan, and also my colleagues here. We really do. I really do miss conferencing, and I'm going to do a little bit of it this year. I'm taking off next month and going on an adventure, and of course I actually into the UK. And damn if they don't start wars, somewhere in between me and and I'm thinking today, and I might have to go around the other way. But wasn't the pandemic enough? Couldn't we settle down a little bit? But things just are a little bit crazy now. They still are. But I'm hoping we'll get back to that. Now I'm hoping we'll get back to the place where we can bring scholars here. But in the meantime, it's just absolutely delightful to be able to talk to you, in your morning.
Yeah, well, this has been terrific, Tom, and I'm honored to be here, and thank you so much for reaching out. And it's been a delight, and to talk to you, to hear your views, and it's really got me thinking about all sorts of additional things.
Well, we can do this again too, when some new stuff comes out. Okay, thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.